The illusion of order. Evelyn Harper squinted at her reflection in the hallway mirror, smoothing back a stray wisp of hair that had slipped from her tightly coiled bun. She liked things neat, orderly, controlled. Her house, a stately white colonial with dark blue shutters, looked out onto Oakwood Park, the small neighborhood centerpiece of perfectly manicured lawns and fresh mulch beds. Each morning, she walked around the park's perimeter, noting every detail, every deviation from the norm with keen eyes and a mental notebook. Today was no different. The Petersons had left their recycling bins a few inches from the curb, not fully tucked back by the house. A subtle shake of her head and Evelyn moved along, crossing over the sidewalk and into the park. She inhaled the crisp morning air, savoring the familiar scent of freshly cut grass, mingled with the lingering fragrance of Mrs. Johnson's blooming roses just across the street. As she walked along the winding path to her favorite bench, she noticed her mind drifting. She missed the days when her husband, Harold, was alive, and her son, David, was still young and bright-eyed. The house felt large and echoing these days, every corner heavy with memories. But Evelyn quickly dismissed the thought. She didn't like to dwell on the past. There was a routine, a rhythm to uphold, and that meant staying focused. When she reached her bench, a well-worn wooden seat nestled beneath an oak tree with the best view of the park playground. She settled in with her thermos of coffee, watching as families began to fill the park, children's laughter ringing out like music. It was comforting, familiar. But then her gaze fell on an unfamiliar scene. On the swings, a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, and black, was pushing a small boy with a mess of curly blonde hair and a wild, infectious laugh. Evelyn's grip on her thermos tightened, her pulse quickening. The sight felt strange, jarring. There were many young fathers in the neighborhood, but she'd never seen this man or this child before. And that nagging feeling that something was off itched in her mind, demanding her attention. She took a slow sip of her coffee, watching the man closely. He laughed along with the boy, who squealed in delight, asking to be pushed higher. His tone was warm, easy, affectionate. A father, no doubt. Or maybe, no. Evelyn pushed the thought away. She tried to look elsewhere, but her gaze kept drifting back, her mind filled with a string of questioning thoughts. She muttered to herself, "It just doesn't add up, does it?" The man lifted the child from the swing, his arms secure around the boy, and set him down on the ground. Evelyn watched as he knelt down, his hands gentle on the boy's shoulders, speaking to him softly. The child's face broke into a grin as the man gave him a playful nudge toward the slide. Evelyn felt a knot of unease tighten in her stomach. What if something wasn't right here? What if that child was in trouble? The boy ran to the slide, and the man followed behind, climbing to the top to help him down. As the child shouted, "Daddy, watch," Evelyn's chest tightened. "Daddy?" she whispered, doubtfully. Evelyn thought back to her son at that age, his blonde hair and freckled cheeks, so precious and vulnerable. "Oh, I just have to be sure," she mumbled, fishing her phone from her purse. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the emergency number. She had no real evidence, after all. But the unsettling feeling gnawed at her, and her instincts told her to act. Evelyn convinced herself she was doing what any good, responsible citizen would. Taking a deep breath, she dialed 911. A calm voice answered. 911. "What's your emergency?" Evelyn's voice trembled slightly. "I think I may be witnessing a situation in Oakwood Park. There's a man here with a young boy, and they don't look related. The child is calling him Daddy, but I just think it's unusual. They don't look alike at all, you see." The operator's voice was level. "Can you provide a description of the man and the child?" "Yes," Evelyn replied, giving a detailed account of what the man and the boy looked like, her words tumbling out in a rush. The operator thanked her, and Evelyn hung up, her hand trembling. She took a shaky sip of her coffee, trying to calm her nerves. "It's for the best," She reassured herself. It's better to be safe than sorry. But as minutes ticked by, Evelyn found herself doubting her decision. The man and child continued playing, unaware of her scrutiny, the man's easy laughter blending with the boy's squeals of joy. Then, just as Evelyn was considering slipping away, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, and she felt a pang of anxiety. This is what you wanted, she reminded herself, but her stomach twisted with unease. The sirens grew louder, and within moments, 2 police cars pulled up at the edge of the park, their lights flashing. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding as 4 officers stepped out, assessing the scene. She watched as they walked toward the man, their expressions serious, their movements careful but brisk. One officer called out, "Sir, please step away from the child." The man looked up, a puzzled expression on his face. He held Theo's hand protectively, his eyes wide with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone calm but tense. He instinctively pulled the boy closer. "Hands where we can see them," another officer instructed, his voice firm. Evelyn's pulse raced as she watched the officers close in on the man. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs rising as they watched the scene unfold. "Wait," the man said, alarmed. I'm Theo's father. We're just playing at the park." The officers exchanged a glance, but one kept his hand on his holster, his posture stiff. "Sir, we received a report about a possible abduction," he said. "We need to confirm your identity." Evelyn watched, her heart hammering in her chest. She felt a strange sense of vindication. "See," she thought, "I was right to call." But as she looked at the confusion and fear on the man's face and the small boy's tearful expression, she felt a pang of uncertainty. "Please, this is a mistake," the man pleaded, his voice wavering. "Theo's my son." He looked down at the boy, who was clinging to him tightly. "Tell them, buddy. Tell them who I am." The officers separated them, leading the boy aside while questioning the man. The child's voice rang out, trembling and confused. "Daddy, Daddy, don't go." The sound of Theo's cries pierced through Evelyn's satisfaction, sending a chill down her spine. She had thought she was doing the right thing, hadn't she? That little boy was supposed to be in danger, but as she watched, she saw nothing but fear and bewilderment on his face. As one officer attempted to handcuff the man, the boy broke free, rushing to his father's side. He threw his arms around him, crying, "Daddy, I'm scared." The park fell silent as the onlookers absorbed the scene before them, the realization dawning on their faces. Even the officers froze, their expressions conflicted as they processed the boy's desperate plea. Evelyn felt as if the world were tilting beneath her. At that moment, a woman, breathless and wild-eyed, came running toward them. "What's happening?" "Theo. Marcus." She raced up to the police officers, wrapping her arms around the child and looking frantically at Marcus. "He's our son. He's our family." The lead officer looked stunned, and the others exchanged wary glances. They uncuffed Marcus, apologizing as they explained the call and the reason they had acted as they had. Marcus stared back in disbelief, hurt mingling with confusion. His partner wrapped an arm around him and held Theo close. Standing apart, Evelyn felt rooted to her spot, unable to move as the consequences of her actions sank in. She had wanted to protect her community, her sense of safety and order. But instead, she had caused fear and pain for this family, people who belonged in the neighborhood just as much as she did, if not more. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, and Evelyn felt her face flush as she met their judgmental stares. "What have I done?" she thought, her chest tightening as shame filled her. She turned away, stumbling down the path back to her house, unable to shake the image of Theo clinging to his father, his tear-streaked face etched in her mind. The walls of her tidy, pristine life seemed to crumble around her, leaving her to confront the mess she had created. The weight of consequence. Evelyn shut her front door, feeling the familiar click of the latch echo through her house. She leaned back against the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Outside, The sun was still shining, casting warm light across her immaculately kept lawn. But Evelyn felt cold, as if a shadow had fallen over her. Her hands trembled, and she clasped them together to steady herself, desperately trying to shake off the events that had unfolded at the park. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she thought, sinking into the armchair by her bay window. She had always seen herself as a protector, a person who looked out for her neighborhood, keeping it safe and orderly. But now, for the first time, Evelyn questioned her instincts. She peered out the window, her eyes scanning the street. Mrs. Johnson was watering her garden, her hat tilted against the afternoon sun. But when Evelyn's gaze landed on her, Mrs. Johnson quickly turned away, avoiding eye contact. Evelyn felt her stomach clench as she realized that Mrs. Johnson had likely been one of the witnesses at the park. Oh, what must they think of me now? Evelyn's heart pounded as she imagined the whispers that would soon circulate. She had always cared deeply about the way others perceived her, prided herself on being a respected member of the community. But now she was certain her reputation was tarnished, maybe irreparably. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling an unfamiliar chill settle over her, as though the warmth that usually filled her home had seeped out, leaving only the cold, hollow echo of her mistake. Hours passed, and Evelyn remained seated in her chair, watching the world outside. Children passed by on bikes, laughing and carefree, but their parents cast quick glances in her direction, hurriedly ushering their kids along. The sight left her feeling more isolated than ever, an outsider in the community she had once felt so connected to. By the next morning, Evelyn decided that she couldn't simply sit in her home and wallow in shame. She had always been resilient, a person who faced her challenges head-on. She told herself that it would all blow over soon. People had short memories, after all. All she had to do was keep to her routine, to remind the neighborhood of the person she'd always been, and surely they'd forgive her. With a renewed sense of determination, Evelyn slipped into her walking shoes and pulled on a light cardigan before stepping out onto her front porch. She inhaled deeply, letting the cool morning air fill her lungs, hoping it would bolster her resolve. Nothing has changed, she told herself firmly. I'm still Evelyn Harper, a respectable woman, a community pillar. As she started down the sidewalk, she noticed familiar faces. There was Mr. Thompson from 2 houses down, walking his dog. She raised her hand to wave, but he barely acknowledged her, giving a tight-lipped nod before quickly looking away. Evelyn felt her confidence waver, but brushed it off, continuing down the path toward the park. But the chill persisted, sinking deeper as she realized that every person she encountered seemed to avoid her gaze, greeting her with hesitant smiles or quick nods, never lingering long enough to exchange words. Evelyn's sense of purpose began to crumble with each passing interaction, or rather, lack thereof. By the time she reached her usual bench, she felt like a stranger in her own neighborhood. Taking a seat, she pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, bracing herself against the uncomfortable silence that seemed to settle around her like an invisible barrier. She watched as parents played with their children, sharing laughter and easy companionship. It should have been a comforting sight, but now it felt like an accusation, as if every joyful moment was a reminder of her misjudgment. As she sat there, Evelyn noticed a small group of women near the playground, deep in conversation. She recognized them, neighbors she used to chat with at book club meetings, exchange recipes with at potlucks. For a brief moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she could join them, explain herself, and maybe they'd understand. She took a tentative step forward, opening her mouth to call out, but the women had already noticed her. She saw their expressions shift, first to surprise, then discomfort. They exchanged glances before quickly gathering their things, murmuring hasty goodbyes and heading toward the parking lot. Evelyn's outstretched hand fell to her side, and she felt her face flush with shame. She was alone, and it was her own doing. Her mind raced, trying to come up with ways to repair the damage she had caused. Maybe I could bake cookies and deliver them as a peace offering, she thought, trying to console herself. But she immediately dismissed the idea, realizing how hollow it sounded. Cookies couldn't erase the hurt she had caused. She had gone too far, hurt an innocent man and his child. And now her neighbors, the people she had known for years, wanted nothing to do with her. Evelyn returned home that morning with a heavy heart, her usual pride replaced by an unfamiliar sense of dread. She shut the door quietly, lingering for a moment in the hallway as she glanced around her house. The walls, once comforting in their familiarity, now felt stifling. Every picture frame, every piece of furniture seemed to mock her, a reminder of the life she had worked so hard to build and how it had all begun to slip through her fingers in an instant. The hours crawled by, filled with nothing but silence and regret. Evelyn tried to distract herself by tidying the house, organizing cabinets, even attempting to lose herself in a book, but her mind kept drifting back to the park. She could still see Theo's tear-streaked face, the way he had clung to his father, his small hands gripping his shirt, as if he feared letting go would make him disappear. And Marcus, she remembered his expression as the officers questioned him, how he'd looked at her with confusion and pain when the truth came to light. It was a look that cut through her pride, exposing her deepest fears and prejudices. Finally, in a desperate attempt to shake off her guilt, Evelyn reached for her phone, dialing her son David's number. She knew he was busy, working long hours at his firm, but she needed to hear a familiar voice, needed someone to remind her that she was still a good person, still the mother he had looked up to. The phone rang several times before David answered, his voice brisk and hurried. "Mom, I don't have much time," he said, a hint of impatience in his tone. "Is everything all right?" Yes, everything's fine," Evelyn replied quickly, feeling a pang of disappointment at his hurried tone. She tried to keep her voice steady, masking the turmoil churning within her. "I just wanted to hear your voice, that's all." There was a pause on the other end, and Evelyn could picture David glancing at his watch, his mind already drifting to the next task on his list. "I'm really swamped, Mom. Can I call you back later?" Evelyn forced a smile, though there was no one there to see it. "Of course, dear. I didn't mean to interrupt." David's tone softened slightly, but she could still sense the distance between them, the divide that seemed to grow with each passing year. "Take care of yourself, Mom. I'll check in soon." As the line disconnected, Evelyn set the phone down, feeling more alone than ever. The reality of her situation settled over her, an oppressive weight she couldn't escape. Her son, her last remaining family, was drifting away, and her neighbors, the people she had once thought of as friends, were turning their backs on her, all because of a decision she had made in a moment of fear and suspicion. Days turned into weeks, and the sense of isolation only grew. Evelyn began to avoid her morning walks, finding solace instead in the solitude of her garden. She spent hours tending to her roses, their delicate petals a small comfort in her increasingly lonely world. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to weather life's challenges, but now, for the first time, she felt adrift, as if she were a stranger in her own life. The whispers followed her wherever she went. At the grocery store, she caught snippets of conversation, her name slipping from hushed voices as people cast furtive glances in her direction. She overheard one woman say, "Did you hear what Evelyn Harper did at the park?" Imagine the nerve. Each comment felt like a thorn, pricking at her carefully constructed sense of self. She had once been respected, admired even, but now she was the subject of gossip and judgment, her name a symbol of suspicion and prejudice. One evening, as she sat alone in her living room, Evelyn felt a wave of despair wash over her. She looked around at the familiar surroundings, the framed photographs of her family, her late husband's armchair, the small mementos she had collected over the years. But none of it brought her comfort. Instead, she felt a hollow ache, a longing for connection and belonging that her material possessions couldn't fill. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, Evelyn made a decision. She couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep pretending that everything would go back to normal on its own. She needed to face the truth, to confront the reality of her actions and the pain she had caused. But how? The idea of facing Marcus and his family, of admitting her mistake, terrified her. What if they rejected her? What if they refused to forgive her? The fear of rejection held her back, paralyzing her with doubt. But deep down, Evelyn knew that this was a fear she would have to face. She had spent her life living in the safety of her own assumptions, but now, for the first time, she realized that real growth came from confronting uncomfortable truths. And so, with a heavy heart, Evelyn resolved to take the first step toward making things right, knowing that it would be a difficult journey, but one that she could no longer avoid. Facing the shadows. Days turned to weeks, but the guilt that weighed on Evelyn Harper's heart did not lessen. Instead, it intensified with each passing day, refusing to release its grip on her. The once comforting walls of her home now felt more like a prison, and the silence, once peaceful, now seemed to echo with the sound of Theo's cries and Marcus's bewildered, pained expression. Her pride had kept her from confronting Marcus and his family, the very people she had wronged. Yet she knew that until she did, her guilt would remain a wound that refused to heal. Evelyn felt her entire life shrinking under the weight of her shame. Gone were the days of cheerful chats with neighbors, or the satisfaction she'd once felt in keeping a watchful eye over Oakwood Park. Now she moved through her days like a ghost, hoping not to be seen, fearing the judgment in every glance cast her way. Evelyn had always been proud of her reputation, her status as a reliable, trustworthy neighbor. But now her very identity felt fractured, and she was left to face the harsh truth. She had failed, and that failure had been public, irreversible. And still, she hadn't apologized to the people who mattered most, the family she had harmed. How did I become this person? She wondered. She didn't have an answer, but she knew she needed to make amends, to step out from behind the walls she'd built around herself. And so, one crisp morning in late autumn, Evelyn made a decision that filled her with both dread and resolve. She would go to Marcus's home and apologize. The walk to their house, just a few blocks away, was agonizingly long. Each step felt heavier than the last, her mind spinning with questions and fears. What will I say? What if they don't want to hear it? What if they slam the door in my face? She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the sound of the fallen leaves crunching beneath her feet, grounding herself in the small sensory details as her anxiety rose. Evelyn finally reached the small, modest house at the edge of the park, a charming home with a bright blue door and a small, flourishing garden out front. She paused, staring at the house as though it were a fortress. She could see signs of warmth and life, a toy car lying in the driveway, a small planter with freshly watered herbs. It was a place filled with love, a love she had once looked upon with suspicion and mistrust. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it, suddenly aware of how hollow her apology might seem. She didn't know this family. She'd only assumed things about them from a distance, reduced them to nothing more than a threat to her orderly life. Now she was here, seeking something she wasn't sure she deserved: forgiveness. Evelyn finally steeled herself and knocked on the door, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet morning air. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her, holding her breath as footsteps approached from the other side. The door swung open, and there stood Marcus, looking surprised and a little wary, his brows furrowing as he took in her presence. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, neither one speaking. Evelyn opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She swallowed, struggling to find the courage to speak. "Hello, Marcus," she managed, her voice wavering slightly. I'm not sure if you'll even want to hear what I have to say, but I felt that I had to come and apologize. For everything." Marcus's expression remained guarded, though a flicker of emotion crossed his eyes. He didn't respond immediately, and Evelyn felt her heart sink. She had come all this way, bracing herself for this moment, and now, facing his silence, she felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. Evelyn took a shaky breath, continuing, "I know that my actions that day were wrong. I jumped to conclusions without knowing anything about you or your family. I let my assumptions guide me. And her voice cracked, and she forced herself to steady it. I'm deeply sorry for the pain I caused you and Theo. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, shame filling her. She had expected him to respond with anger, perhaps to tell her to leave and never return. She would have understood if he did. But instead, Marcus remained silent, considering her words, his expression softening slightly. Finally, he spoke, his tone quiet but firm. I appreciate you coming here to apologize, Evelyn. But you have to understand, the harm you caused didn't end that day. Theo was terrified. He didn't understand why the police thought I was a stranger. He kept asking me if he was different from the other kids in the neighborhood, why people look at us differently. Evelyn's heart twisted at his words, a pang of regret piercing her as she imagined the confusion and hurt Theo must have felt. She tried to picture the world through his eyes, to imagine what it would be like to grow up feeling like an outsider in a place that should have been his home. I can't even imagine what that must have been like for him, Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now how wrong I was. I should have seen the love between you and Theo. I should have trusted what I saw with my own eyes, not what my mind told me to see. Marcus crossed his arms, studying her carefully. There was a quiet strength in his posture, a resilience that Evelyn hadn't fully noticed before. She felt small in his presence, humbled by the grace with which he was handling the situation. You know, Evelyn, he began, his tone softening slightly, this neighborhood has never really felt like home for us. We moved here for Theo, hoping he'd have a safe place to grow up, a community that would accept us. But that day in the park made me wonder if we'd made the right choice. Evelyn felt a surge of guilt and sorrow, a deep ache in her chest as she realized the full extent of what her actions had nearly cost this family. She looked up, meeting his gaze with a steady determination. Marcus, I can't take back what I did, but I want you to know that I intend to do better. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or even at all. But I'm willing to work to make things right, to be someone Theo can feel safe around. I owe you that much. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of her words hanging between them. Evelyn felt a strange sense of relief, as though simply voicing her remorse had lifted a part of the burden she'd been carrying. She didn't know if Marcus would ever fully forgive her, but at least she had taken the first step toward acknowledging her mistakes. Just then, a small voice piped up from behind Marcus. Daddy, who's that? Theo peered around his father, his bright blue eyes wide with curiosity. Evelyn felt her heart soften at the sight of him, his innocence a stark reminder of the harm she'd caused. This is Evelyn, Theo, Marcus said gently, glancing down at his son. She came to say hello. Evelyn crouched down, offering Theo a tentative smile. Hello, Theo. I'm very sorry for what I did to you and your dad. I made a big mistake. Theo looked at her for a moment, his head tilted in a way that reminded Evelyn so much of David at that age, curious, open-hearted, and endlessly forgiving. He took a small step toward her, his face softening. It's okay, he said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He reached for his father's hand, giving him a reassuring squeeze. Daddy, can we go play now? Marcus smiled, his expression relaxing as he glanced at Evelyn. We're going to the park. Theo's got a soccer game tomorrow, and we need to get in some practice. Evelyn nodded, rising to her feet. She felt a flicker of hope, a small sense that perhaps in time she could begin to mend the rift she had caused. As she stepped back, ready to leave them to their day, Marcus paused, looking at her thoughtfully. You're welcome to join us sometime, Evelyn, he said, his tone sincere. If you're serious about doing better, maybe you could start by getting to know us. Evelyn felt a swell of gratitude, her throat tightening as she met his gaze. I would like that very much, Marcus, she replied, her voice soft with emotion. As she turned to walk back home, Evelyn felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. It was only a small step, but it was enough to set her on a new path. She would never forget the pain she'd caused, but now she had the chance to rebuild, to become a person worthy of the trust she had once so easily taken for granted. And so, with each step, Evelyn felt a little lighter, a little closer to the redemption she sought. For the first time in a long time, she believed that change, real, meaningful change, was possible. Bridging the divide. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table that evening, staring at a faded, well-worn photograph she hadn't looked at in years. It was a picture of her son David, taken when he was about Theo's age, his face freckled and sunburned from a summer spent outdoors. She remembered the innocence in his laughter, the way he would run to her without a second thought, his world safe and complete with her and Harold. She wondered if Theo's world had ever felt that way, if he still felt as safe as David had. After her conversation with Marcus, Evelyn had walked home with a mix of relief and dread. She was relieved that she'd managed to apologize, but the shame of her actions continued to haunt her. The task of confronting her biases, of shedding the beliefs she'd held all her life, was overwhelming. She thought of how quickly she'd acted on her assumptions, and how deeply rooted those assumptions must have been. It was an uncomfortable realization that all her life she had carefully maintained her surroundings, yet had rarely questioned the perspectives that had shaped her view of the world. She thought of the little biases she'd absorbed over the years, each one adding to the foundation of her worldview. They were subtle things, whispered remarks, unspoken beliefs, the boundaries of comfort she had never dared to cross. And now she was seeing for the first time just how those quiet assumptions had driven her to hurt people she barely knew. If I'm going to change, she thought, it has to start here with me. She'd spent her life observing the neighborhood through a lens that categorized people as though each person belonged to a tidy label. Now she understood that those labels were part of the problem. She wasn't merely the observer in Oakwood Park, she was part of it, and her role mattered. As the days passed, Evelyn forced herself to keep moving forward. She continued her morning walks, though they felt lonelier than ever. She no longer looked at the tidy lawns or the rose bushes in bloom. Instead, she watched the people she had never truly seen before, the young mother juggling her children and groceries, the elderly couple who walked arm in arm every morning, the teenage boys who gathered at the corner, laughing and roughhousing in the way David once had. It was a quiet shift, subtle yet significant. She noticed things she had overlooked before. The care people took with their families, the warmth in their interactions, the small acts of kindness and connection that held the community together. For the first time, Evelyn realized that she was seeing people not as part of the neighborhood landscape, but as individuals, each with a life as complex and valuable as her own. One afternoon, as Evelyn worked in her garden, she noticed a familiar figure approaching down the street. It was Jessica, Marcus's wife, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Evelyn's heart raced. She had seen Jessica only briefly that day at the park, her face stricken with fear and confusion as she raced to her family's side. Now, seeing her up close brought a fresh wave of guilt. Evelyn. Jessica's voice was gentle, a quiet question as she reached the edge of the garden. Evelyn straightened, brushing the dirt from her hands as she met Jessica's gaze. She felt vulnerable, exposed, standing there in the garden she had so meticulously tended. "Hello, Jessica," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jessica offered a tentative smile, lifting the basket slightly. "I baked some zucchini bread, and I thought you might like a loaf. We had too much, and Marcus suggested I bring some by." Evelyn blinked, taken aback by the simple kindness of the gesture. She felt a rush of gratitude, but also an overwhelming sense of unworthiness. "That's very thoughtful of you. Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica stepped forward, holding out the basket. "You're welcome. I also thought it might be nice to get to know each other better." She paused, looking directly at Evelyn. "For Theo's sake. He's been asking about you since that day at the park." Evelyn felt her cheeks flush with shame, but she saw no malice in Jessica's gaze, only a quiet determination. "I would like that very much," Evelyn replied, her voice wavering slightly. She hesitated before adding, "I never meant to hurt your family. I thought I was protecting the community, but I realize now that I was only protecting my own assumptions." Jessica nodded, her expression softening. "I understand. It's not an easy thing, changing how we see the world. But I believe that people can change if they're willing to try." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat at Jessica's words. It was a small statement, yet it held a vast reservoir of forgiveness, of hope. She gestured toward the garden bench. Would you like to sit for a while?" Jessica nodded, settling onto the bench beside her, and they sat in a companionable silence, listening to the rustle of leaves in the autumn breeze. For a moment, Evelyn felt an odd sense of peace, as though the garden were a small sanctuary, a place where things could begin anew. As they talked, Evelyn found herself sharing more than she had intended. Her memories of raising David, her fears of loneliness, the struggle she faced in adjusting to life without her husband. Jessica listened with quiet empathy, occasionally nodding or offering a gentle word. It was the kind of connection Evelyn hadn't felt in years, the kind of friendship she hadn't realized she needed. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Theo has always been a curious child, and he doesn't see the world the way adults do. He doesn't understand why people look at our family differently, why some people make assumptions about us. He just sees his dad and mom, and that's enough for him. Sometimes I wish we could all see the world that way." Evelyn felt a pang of regret, thinking back to the carefree days of her own childhood. She had grown up with a similar innocence, but somewhere along the way, that innocence had been lost, replaced by a rigid set of beliefs that had closed her off from truly understanding others. She looked at Jessica, marveling at her strength, her ability to face the world with open eyes and a forgiving heart. "Jessica," Evelyn began, her voice barely a whisper, "I want to be better. I don't want to live with these walls around me anymore. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to learn to understand." Jessica placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's, giving it a comforting squeeze. "It's never too late to change, Evelyn. We all carry things we need to let go of. But you're here, and you're willing. That's a start." As they continued talking, Evelyn felt her defenses crumble, replaced by a sense of vulnerability that was both terrifying and liberating. She had spent her life controlling her surroundings, her image, her reputation. But now, she saw that real connection required letting go of that control. She realized that Jessica and Marcus had extended a hand not out of obligation, but out of genuine kindness, and she felt a new determination to meet them halfway. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn made a conscious effort to reach out. She invited Marcus, Jessica, and Theo over for tea, nervously setting out her best china, hoping to make them feel welcome. She felt clumsy, out of her depth, as though she were learning a new language, but the family's warmth and openness encouraged her, easing her fears. Theo, with his innocent curiosity, brought an unexpected joy into her life. He peppered her with questions about her garden, eager to learn the names of each flower and plant. Evelyn, who had always kept her gardening knowledge to herself, found herself explaining the intricacies of pruning roses, of planting bulbs in the fall. She watched as Theo listened with rapt attention, his face lighting up with each new discovery. One afternoon, as they tended to a small bed of marigolds, Theo looked up at her, his blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Miss Evelyn, were you always friends with my mommy and daddy?" Evelyn felt a pang of sadness, knowing how her actions had impacted Theo's understanding of the world. She knelt down beside him, meeting his gaze. "No, Theo, we weren't always friends," she replied gently. "But sometimes we make mistakes, and if we're lucky, we get a chance to make things right." Theo seemed to consider her words carefully before nodding, as if he understood something deeper than she had intended. He reached out and took her hand, giving it a small squeeze. "It's okay, Miss Evelyn. Daddy says everyone can be good if they try. Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't known in years. Theo's forgiveness, his simple faith in her, felt like a gift she hadn't earned, yet she cherished it deeply. As the autumn days grew shorter and the leaves turned brilliant shades of red and gold, Evelyn found herself looking forward to her time with Marcus's family, cherishing the small moments of connection they shared. She knew that her journey was far from over, that she still had much to learn, but for the first time in her life, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps she could change, that she could become a person worthy of the trust and forgiveness she had been given. And so, as the days passed, Evelyn took each step forward with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to become the kind of neighbor, the kind of friend, that her community and Marcus's family deserved. Testing new paths. As the chill of autumn deepened, Oakwood Park transformed. The trees, heavy with red and amber leaves, rustled in the wind, and Evelyn Harper's daily walks took on a different tone. She no longer walked with the solitary determination she once had, avoiding glances from neighbors. Instead, she felt a part of the life around her, a piece of a larger, imperfect, and beautifully diverse picture. Evelyn continued to meet with Marcus's family regularly. They would share simple meals at her home or theirs, and Evelyn often invited Theo into her garden, teaching him the nuances of preparing plants for the coming winter. But as she slowly rebuilt trust with the family she had wronged, Evelyn knew that her journey to make amends was not yet complete. There were still ghosts lingering, moments when self-doubt or lingering shame clouded her mind. She had come a long way, but every step reminded her of the ground she had yet to cover. One crisp Saturday morning, Evelyn gathered her courage and decided to do something she hadn't done in months. She would attend the community book club meeting held in Mrs. Johnson's living room. The group had once been a staple of her monthly routine, a chance to socialize and discuss novels with other women in the neighborhood. But since the incident in the park, she had avoided it, too ashamed to face the sideways glances and whispers she knew would follow. When she entered Mrs. Johnson's cozy living room, the conversation fell to a whisper. The women exchanged glances, surprise and discomfort evident in their expressions. Evelyn took a deep breath, gripping her tote bag filled with notes on the month's novel. She had always been diligent about book club, her thoughts meticulously recorded, her perspectives keen and insightful. But today, the weight of her past actions overshadowed her usual confidence. Mrs. Johnson gestured to an empty chair near the middle of the group, offering Evelyn a warm smile. "Evelyn, it's been a while," she said, her tone welcoming yet cautious. Evelyn nodded, her cheeks flushing. "Yes, I thought it was time to come back. I've missed this." She gave Mrs. Johnson a small, appreciative smile before taking her seat, pulling out her notes as she forced herself to meet the gazes of the other women in the room. The discussion turned to the novel, a story about friendship overcoming societal boundaries and hardships. The irony wasn't lost on Evelyn, who listened more than she spoke, noticing the subtle shift in how the women responded to her presence. In the past, her voice had held a certain authority in the group, her comments listened to with respect. Now, each time she spoke, she felt an unspoken question hanging in the air. "Can we trust you again, Evelyn?" Halfway through the meeting, Mrs. Peterson, who had always been one of Evelyn's closest friends, spoke up. Her tone was gentle but probing. "Evelyn," she began, "you've been missed. I think some of us were surprised not to see you around lately, given how involved you've always been with the community." Her words were friendly, yet Evelyn sensed the underlying tension. Evelyn took a deep breath, steeling herself as she looked around at the group. This was her moment to address what everyone had been dancing around. "I owe you all an explanation," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I know I've been absent lately. I made a terrible mistake, one that hurt people in ways I can't easily fix. I called the police on Marcus and his son without knowing anything about them, and my actions have affected not just them, but this whole neighborhood." A heavy silence fell over the room. Evelyn felt exposed, raw, But she pressed on. I've spent the past few months trying to make amends, to understand how I could have let my assumptions hurt others so deeply. It hasn't been easy, but it's opened my eyes in ways I never expected. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, her eyes softening. We all make mistakes, Evelyn. I think what matters is that you're willing to change. That takes courage. The others nodded slowly, a few offering hesitant smiles. Evelyn felt a surge of relief wash over her. For the first time since the incident, she felt a small measure of acceptance, not absolution, but a tentative forgiveness that gave her hope. As the meeting drew to a close, Evelyn felt lighter, more at ease. The burden she'd been carrying felt a little less heavy, and she walked home with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew she had been given a second chance, not just with Marcus's family, but with her neighbors as well. The following day, as Evelyn walked through the park, she noticed Marcus and Theo at the playground. Theo was gleefully racing down the slide, his laughter filling the crisp air, while Marcus watched with a smile. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, then decided to approach them. She waved to Marcus, who returned her smile warmly. "Hello, Evelyn," he greeted her, his tone open and friendly. Theo bounded over to her, his eyes shining. "Miss Evelyn," he exclaimed, tugging at her hand. "Daddy says we can have a picnic. Do you want to come?" Evelyn's heart swelled at his innocent enthusiasm. "I'd love that, Theo," she replied, feeling a warmth spread through her. They found a spot under a sprawling oak tree, laying out a blanket and unpacking sandwiches, apple slices, and a thermos of hot cider that Jessica had prepared. As they sat and shared the simple meal, Evelyn felt a sense of connection, a feeling that went beyond words. She was no longer just a neighbor observing from a distance. She was part of their lives, part of their world. As they ate, Marcus told stories about his childhood, and Evelyn listened intently, learning more about him and his experiences. She realized that she had spent so much of her life seeing people like Marcus as different, as separate from herself, and now she saw how narrow her perspective had been. Each story he shared opened her mind a little further, challenging her assumptions and breaking down the barriers she had once thought were necessary. After lunch, Theo ran off to play, and Evelyn found herself alone with Marcus. She felt a moment of nervousness, but Marcus's calm demeanor reassured her. "You know, Evelyn," Marcus began, his tone thoughtful, "I used to think that this neighborhood would never fully accept us. But these past few weeks have shown me that people can change, that sometimes it just takes a little understanding." Evelyn nodded, feeling a pang of guilt, but also gratitude for his generosity. "Thank you for giving me a chance, Marcus. I know it couldn't have been easy. I still have a lot to learn, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better." Marcus offered her a reassuring smile. "We all have things we need to work on, Evelyn. What matters is that you're trying, and for what it's worth, I think you're making progress." As the weeks passed, Evelyn found herself more deeply connected to the community than she had ever been before. She attended local events, joined in neighborhood gatherings, and volunteered at the community center where Marcus worked. She no longer saw her neighbors as mere characters in her carefully ordered world. She saw them as people, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams. One Saturday, Evelyn noticed that a new family had moved into the house at the corner of her street. The family was young, and Evelyn recognized the look of apprehension in their eyes as they unloaded their belongings. She remembered how she had once viewed newcomers with suspicion, but now she felt a kinship, a desire to welcome them as she had been welcomed back into the fold. Evelyn gathered a small basket of cookies and walked over to their house, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As she introduced herself and offered her welcome, she saw the relief in their faces, the warmth that came from simple kindness. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a testament to the changes she had embraced. As the season shifted to winter, Evelyn's life settled into a new rhythm. She continued to spend time with Marcus and his family, cherishing the moments of laughter and connection they shared. Theo became a regular visitor in her garden, eagerly helping her plant bulbs for spring, his laughter filling her once silent yard. One evening, as Evelyn sat by her window, watching the snow fall gently over Oakwood Park, she felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey had been painful and humbling, but it had led her to a place of genuine connection and understanding. She had learned that forgiveness was not a single act, but a process, a choice made again and again, in small ways, in simple moments. And as she looked out at the quiet, snow-covered street, Evelyn knew that her story was not over. She still had much to learn, much to give. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly at home, surrounded by a community that accepted her, flaws and all. She was no longer the woman watching from her window, isolated and afraid. She was part of something larger, something messy and beautiful, something real. In the end, Evelyn had found a new purpose, a new path, and as she drifted off to sleep, she knew that she would continue walking that path, step by step, hand in hand with the people she had once kept at arm's length. A new chapter of belonging. Winter deepened, casting Oakwood Park in a soft, silvery light, and Evelyn Harper's life began to take on a warmth and rhythm she hadn't experienced in years. Her days were no longer marked by solitary walks and silent mornings. Instead, her schedule filled with activities that connected her to her neighbors in new and meaningful ways. She attended every book club meeting, and her presence was no longer the cause of discomfort or hushed whispers. In fact, Mrs. Johnson and the others often stopped to listen to her insights, her voice once again carrying a weight of respect, earned, this time, through humility and an openness to change. Evelyn's friendship with Marcus, Jessica, and Theo blossomed in ways she never anticipated. Jessica and she would often sit in the cozy warmth of Evelyn's living room, sipping tea as they shared stories, their laughter carrying through the house like a gentle reminder of the beauty in human connection. It was Jessica who noticed Evelyn's knitting basket one evening and asked, her eyes bright, if Evelyn might teach her how to knit. Evelyn felt a spark of joy at the request. She hadn't picked up her needles in years, not since her late husband Harold had fallen ill. Knitting had been her way to cope with life's uncertainties, each stitch a small effort to control the chaos around her. Teaching Jessica how to knit brought Evelyn a renewed sense of purpose, a chance to pass on something dear to her. They would sit for hours, Jessica's hands slowly mastering the delicate movements as Evelyn guided her through each pattern, her heart swelling with pride as Jessica's skills grew. One afternoon, as Evelyn finished showing Jessica the intricacies of a new stitch, Jessica looked up at her, her expression thoughtful. "You know, Evelyn, I never imagined we'd become this close," she admitted, her tone soft. "In the beginning, I wasn't sure what to think. I knew you felt a certain way about us, and I didn't know if you could change. But now," she paused, her gaze warm, "I'm glad I was wrong." Evelyn felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so much of her life holding on to rigid beliefs, clinging to a narrow understanding of the world. And yet here she was, sitting across from Jessica, a woman who had every reason to keep her at a distance, sharing in a moment of friendship that felt both fragile and profound. "I'm glad too, Jessica," Evelyn replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Meeting you and your family has changed me in ways I never thought possible. I spent so many years watching the world from a distance, but you've shown me that life is richer when you're part of it." Jessica reached across the table, giving Evelyn's hand a gentle squeeze. It's never too late to find a new beginning. Their bond extended to Theo, who had come to see Evelyn as his other grandma. The boy had filled Evelyn's once quiet house with a joy and energy that had been missing for far too long. Each time he visited, he would run straight into her garden, his laughter mingling with the winter wind as they tended to the flower beds together, talking about everything from school to the latest games he was playing. On one particular visit, Theo brought over a crumpled drawing he had made of her garden, complete with bright, colorful flowers and a smiling sun. Evelyn marveled at his attention to detail, touched that he had captured the garden so beautifully. "Miss Evelyn," he said proudly, holding up his masterpiece, "this is for you. I wanted to draw our garden." Evelyn took the drawing with trembling hands, a warmth spreading through her chest. She hugged Theo, whispering a heartfelt thank you as she felt her heart expand with a love she hadn't known in years. As winter wore on, Evelyn found herself increasingly involved in the community. She began volunteering at the local library, organizing story time for children, and even leading a small knitting group for newcomers who had moved into the neighborhood. The library staff, initially hesitant around her, quickly grew to appreciate her dedication and kindness. She saw herself in some of the older members who joined her group, their lives marked by a similar solitude, and Evelyn made it her mission to extend a hand of friendship, remembering the isolation she had once felt. One snowy afternoon, as Evelyn walked back from the library, she noticed a familiar face on the path. It was David, her son, bundled in a thick coat, his cheeks red from the cold. He looked up, spotting her, and a smile spread across his face. Evelyn felt her heart leap. It had been weeks since their last conversation, and she hadn't expected him to visit. "David," she called, her voice filled with excitement as she hurried toward him. They embraced, and Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude. She had missed her son deeply, and his presence felt like the missing piece she had been longing for. They walked back to her house together, David listening as she talked about her new friendships, her volunteer work, and the ways her life had changed. She could see the pride in his eyes as he listened, his expression softening as he took in the transformation that had reshaped her world. "I'm proud of you, Mom," David said as they sat down in her living room, the fire crackling warmly beside them. "You've built a life here that I never expected. It's different, but I think it suits you." Evelyn felt her cheeks flush with gratitude. For so long, she had worried that her relationship with David would remain strained, a casualty of the emotional walls she had built around herself. But now, sitting beside him, sharing stories of her new life, Evelyn felt a sense of peace, a feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found a way back to the family she had once pushed away. David stayed for dinner, and they laughed together, sharing memories of the past while forging new ones in the present. As he prepared to leave, David took her hand, his expression serious yet warm. "Mom, if you ever need anything at all, you can call me. I want to be there for you, the way you've been there for everyone else." Evelyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you, David. That means more to me than you know." The next morning, Evelyn awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. Her life had transformed, her world expanded by the friendships she had cultivated, the forgiveness she had received, and the love she had rekindled with her son. She dressed warmly, pulling on her thick coat and scarf, and prepared for the day's activities. She had planned to meet with Marcus and Theo at the park, an outing she had come to cherish as part of her weekly routine. When she arrived at the park, she found Marcus and Theo waiting for her, their smiles bright against the snowy landscape. Theo ran up to her, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the playground with unrestrained excitement. Evelyn laughed, feeling the joy of the moment as she joined in their game, her laughter mingling with Theo's as they built snowmen and tossed snowballs, their laughter echoing through the crisp winter air. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the snowy park, Evelyn took a moment to look around, taking in the beauty of her surroundings. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, a feeling that this messy, imperfect, and beautifully complex life was where she was meant to be. That night, as she sat in her living room, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had faced her darkest fears, confronted the prejudices that had once defined her, and found a new purpose in opening herself to the world around her. Her life was no longer confined to the safe walls she had once relied upon. It was filled with people, with connection, with love. Evelyn Harper was no longer the woman watching from a distance, hidden behind the curtains of her own assumptions. She was part of a community, part of a family, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage, compassion, and an open heart. As she set her cup down, she looked around at her home, the walls now adorned with memories of the people she had come to love and the life she had rebuilt. She realized that, in the end, redemption wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that she would continue to walk, step by step, with the people who had shown her the power of forgiveness and the beauty of second chances. And with that, Evelyn Harper smiled, ready to embrace the new chapter of her life, knowing that she was no longer alone, and that she was, at last, home.